Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to
At the time, 46-year-old Joseph
The Evil Story of Sarah Hartsfield. Mm, Beyond Evil.
had been working as a parole officer in Huntsville, Texas, but with his kids getting older, he was ready to find love again. And with Sarah Jean, Joseph felt like he had hit the jackpot. Charismatic and intelligent, 47-year-old Sarah was a 20-year veteran of the military who had risen to the rank of Sergeant First Class. She was a devoted mother of four grown children, and she made Joseph feel like the most important person in the world. As for Sarah, four failed marriages had left her questioning her judgment, but with Joseph she felt she had finally found someone who treated her the way she deserved.
He's the guy you jump on a plane with. Like, he's that person. Like, whatever you're ready for, he's always ready. He always has your back. No matter what, right or wrong, he has your back.
The pair married only 3 months after meeting. Days after the wedding, they up and moved 2 hours from Joseph's family to a house in Beach City, a stone's throw away from Trinity Bay. It was a whirlwind start with a promising new life. But in those early days, Joseph didn't really know the real Sarah Jean Hartsfield. At midnight on January the 7th, 2023, the Chambers County Sheriff's Office received a 911 call from the home of Sarah and Joseph Hartsfield. It was Sarah who told the operator that she had just found her husband Joseph, a diabetic, unresponsive in his bed with dangerously low blood glucose levels. She had tried giving him jam and juice but could not rouse him. Paramedics transported Joseph to Houston Methodist Hospital, where doctors rushed to save his life. Over the next few hours, he would be pumped with intravenous glucose. Again and again, his blood glucose levels crashed. By now, Joseph had slipped into a coma. His distraught wife, Sarah, took to Facebook. She wrote that Joseph had fallen into a diabetic coma after not managing his insulin properly and was now suffering extensive brain damage. The following day, she posted again with a new diagnosis. Doctors had now confirmed that Joseph had suffered an ischemic stroke caused by a clogged artery. It was a result, she said, of years of eating too much junk food, and now everyone who loved him was going to pay the price. That price ultimately came on January 15th, when, after 8 days in the ICU, Sarah made the tough decision to take Joseph off of life support. She allowed his mother into the hospital to say goodbye to her son, but banned his siblings. They had been so ugly to her, and after all, Joseph was her husband. So today we take the time to honor Joseph. In this moment, we admire Joseph and the family's selfless decision to save others through the gift of organ donation. In the depth of grief, hope has been born. Each person has a unique story to tell, one that will surely not be forgotten. May the impact that Joseph leaves behind be a constant reminder of love and hope. It's because of Joseph and his family we are gathered here today and able to offer hope and life to others. A simple thank you will never be enough. May we take this time together in silence to honor the life of Joseph Hartsfield. The videos raised some eyebrows. People felt that there was something off about Sarah's behavior. A quick cremation followed, and an obituary online for Joseph was posted on February the 1st. It read that Joseph had died, quote, due to complications of an ischemic stroke, with his loving wife at his side. But while medics had been working hard to save Joseph's life, detectives from the Chambers County Sheriff's Office had been investigating the circumstances surrounding his sudden collapse. At 6:30 p.m. on the day Joseph was brought into the hospital, the sheriff's office had received a call by a nurse from the ICU who suspected one of her patients, Joseph Hartsfield, was suffering from an insulin overdose. His wife Sarah had been the only person with him at the time. She claimed to have slept through the repeated alerts from the glucose monitor they both wore, and after finding him unconscious had waited 1 hour before calling 911. Doctors also deduced that Joseph's blood glucose levels had been dangerously low for around 6 hours before the paramedics were called. Suspecting foul play, detectives acquired a search warrant for Hartsfield's home. Next to Joseph's bed, they found 10 empty insulin pens. Various items left in the house contradicted Sarah's accounts of her movements that evening. Doctors now confirmed that Joseph had died from toxic levels of insulin, leading to his stroke. With enough evidence to prosecute, Sarah Hartsfield was arrested.
Tonight, his wife, 48-year-old Sarah Jean Hartsfield, is in the Chambers County Jail, accused of murdering him. An ambulance rushed her incoherent husband to this Baytown hospital on January 7th for a suspicious illness.
For as fast as they would think that he was getting better, he would immediately turn back right around and start crashing.
Chambers County Sheriff Brian Hawthorne says investigators dug in and performed search warrants. A grand jury returned an indictment Friday before deputies arrested her at their Beach City home. Investigators say she's lived in 39 different places throughout her adult life, and this was her 5th marriage.
When we started talking to other husbands, and then finding out some of them maybe aren't alive anymore, and other issues, everything just started pointing to foul play.
They interviewed at least 3 living exes.
Every relationship that appears that she's been in, everybody wants out of it because they fear for their life.
From the earliest days of the investigation, Chambers County District Attorney Cheryl Light Henry had felt something was off about Sarah. She was right. As detectives investigated her past, they discovered one bizarre incident after the next. Mysterious deaths, allegations of arson, attempted murder, and assault. Was Sarah Hartsfield a serial wife or a serial killer? To answer that question, we need to go back to 1987, when a woman turned up at a Missouri CPS center with her 12-year-old daughter in tow, demanding they take her off her hands. That girl was Sarah Jean Smith. Sarah was put in the care of Barb and Steve Stewart, who lived in a small town 15 minutes from Sarah's own family. Child Protective Services warned Barb that Sarah had suffered significant abuse at the hands of her biological father. Sarah's mother had since divorced her father and remarried, but her new stepfather was fresh out of prison after serving a 12-year prison sentence for murder. Sarah would claim that he'd also abused her, but inconsistencies in her story led to the allegations being dismissed. Inconsistencies in Sarah's stories was something that she'd soon be known for, both among her friends and her foster parents. You just never knew with Sarah what was true and what wasn't, and there was something else that made Barb uneasy. While Sarah never raised her voice, her rage was unsettling. Once, when she was angry, she threatened to call and tell police that Barb's husband had been inappropriate with her. Barb and Steve persevered. Soon enough, Sarah had become a valued member of their family. But then came the first of what would turn into a long line of bizarre incidents. Several years after moving in with the Stewarts, Sarah's 10-year-old brother, who was still living with their mother in the next town, was found lying dead in the front yard. A nylon dog leash was around his neck. Police theorized that he had been playing with the leash on the front porch and he had fallen off, catching the leash on the railing of the stairs, and had strangled to death. A coroner's report estimated that he must have been hanging for 10 to 20 minutes before falling to the ground. His death was ruled an accident, but a police report described the incident as bizarre. Meanwhile, a caseworker noticed that Sarah's mother had showed virtually no emotion over the loss, and there were discrepancies in her story as well. Sarah picked herself up and carried on, and life with the Stewart family couldn't have been more idyllic. There were family vacations at a lake house and regular shopping trips. At school, Sarah's peers remember her as being popular with both the boys and the girls. She was wild, and the boys lined up to date her. No one could recall anything about Sarah that might suggest what she would be later capable of. But then came Titus Norenschild. Titus met Sarah in 1991 when he was a junior at the same high school. Titus had a reputation as a trusting, good-natured jock. The two began dating. At first, he found Sarah kind, funny, and caring. As the months rolled on, however, a different side of Sarah showed up. This Sarah was controlling, vengeful, someone who would lie and steal money from her friends, someone who, when things did not go her way, was frightening. A pattern developed where Sarah would dump Titus, date other people, and then sweet talk him into taking her back. Against his better judgment, Titus married Sarah in September of 1993. A month after the wedding, they moved to Fort Hood, Texas, so Titus could join the Army. During his first training session, Sarah made the most of her freedom by having an affair. Numerous more affairs followed. By early 1995, Titus was done. He filed for divorce. It should have marked the end of a bad chapter, but Sarah did not take the news as well as he'd hoped.
She just, was making it clear that I shouldn't leave her, she would leave me. And then as it got ugly, she told me that, not to be surprised if I don't make it through this. I was honestly surprised to get out of my marriage alive. Because I was in the Army, I had a $200,000 life insurance on myself at the time. So I was very concerned that I would end up dead so she could get the money.
By the time the divorce was finalized, Titus was telling friends that he felt lucky to escape with his life, only he hadn't escaped, not even close. When Titus began dating his future wife, Angela, strange things began happening. Angela's car was repeatedly vandalized. Her tires were slashed. Abuse scrawled across the windows. Soon, Sarah began openly harassing her.
So she would continuously show up into my life. You think she was on? I have no children with her. There was no reason to be with her at all. And she would call our house and pester me, pester my wife. I was in the service, came back from Germany, got stationed at Fort Hood where she was also, and she showed up in my motor pool with stories of trying to give me stuff back that she kept. Just to find out it was a scheme to try to get me to be with her. She threatened my family when I was in Oklahoma, and my family was still in the Fort Hood area, telling that there she could be stopping by.
Titus and Angela went to the police, but Sarah convinced them that it was Angela who was the problem. It was part of this knack that she had, people said, for charming and manipulating people.
Sarah's a narcissist, and she's good at making herself look like whatever she wants or the other person wants to see.
The police sided with Sarah, and Angela and Titus were told that if they continued harassing her, they would be arrested. And Sarah still was not done with them. One night, while the couple were babysitting a friend's child, Angela smelled gasoline. Thinking it was coming from her car, she went outside. Someone had splashed gasoline over the whole front of the house. Down the street, they saw Sarah's car leaving. She had tried to burn the house down with them in it. Once again, they approached the police, but seeing her leaving the scene did not constitute attempted arson, so they did not pursue it. However, Titus did get a no-contact order.
So, for the military side, I outranked her, and I went through both of our commands, and I was able to get a no-contact order. It's a military form of a protective order. Meant that she could not contact myself or my family. Once she was out, that was null and void. She's very intelligent on how she does things, so trying to get a judge to give me a or a protective order would be very difficult.
Even then, Sarah continued to pop up. Sometimes she would park her car outside of the house. Other times it was visits or phone calls. Meanwhile, her intent on getting revenge had not prevented her from finding a new target. This time, it was Titus's best friend, Michael Traxler. The same month her divorce to Titus was finalized, she married Michael and relocated to Houston, Texas. Like with Titus, the nice girl facade didn't last very long. 2 months after their wedding in January of 1996, police were called to the newlyweds' home. Sarah had attacked Traxler, leaving him with scratches and bruises. The case, however, was dismissed, but by the end of that year, Michael had filed for divorce. Luckily for him, Sarah was too distracted by a new endeavor to focus on revenge. She had joined the Army. Sarah's foster mother, Barb, was surprised. Sarah liked to be the one in control. But Sarah took to it like a duck to water. A decade later, she had worked her way up in the ranks from truck driver to intelligence analyst. And she wasn't just good at her job, she was brilliant. Her former supervisor, Army Captain Markovics, would describe her as whip smart with a special ability for analyzing and compartmentalizing information. Soon it was Sarah giving the orders, which is where things took a turn. Troops began complaining about her leadership style. She had zero tolerance for mistakes, showed no courtesy to anyone beneath her. People became so apprehensive around her that they made sure to never speak to her without someone else around. And she would never admit to a mistake on her part.
She never admitted any, wrongdoing. She's not that kind of person. She's not going to.
Still, Sarah loved her job. It served a valuable purpose, access to an endless supply of men. Within a year of her divorce from her second husband, Traxler, Sarah met Army officer Christopher Donahue. She quickly fell pregnant and the two were married. The birth of their first daughter, Ashley, was followed by a boy, Ryan, and then two more girls. The family established themselves in the upscale neighborhood of Belton, Texas. With four children to care for, Sarah took a step back from her military duties. Then, in 2005, word reached Sarah that her biological father, the man who had abused her, was in poor health. Sarah volunteered to care for him in her home. Her family and friends were stunned, but Sarah explained that she was the best person for the job and collected him from his home in Missouri before setting him up in a spare bedroom. 3 days after he had arrived, Sarah gave him his daily medication. By that afternoon, he was dead. Doctors put his sudden death down to natural causes. After all, he was old, frail, and ill. Others found the episode somehow too convenient to be a coincidence. By 2007, Sarah had returned to active duty and had risen in the ranks to Sergeant First Class with a top secret security clearance. To the people in her community, she was known as a super mom who juggled family life with a top military career. Her children were seen as immaculately dressed and well behaved. Inside Sarah's house was a different story. Her daughter Ashley remembers her as a ticking time bomb. Her son Ryan remembers walking on eggshells, desperate to not make her mad. Even so, beatings were a regular occurrence, and they could go on for hours. Chris Donahue did his best to protect his kids, but no one could stand up to Sarah. Ryan remembers the first time he felt truly terrified of his mother. It was around the time when he was 10 years old. He was taking another beating when Sarah dropped the belt and began using her fist instead. Afterwards, he was so injured that he was out of school for a week. But it wasn't the beating that had scared him. It was how she had acted afterwards, sweet and caring, as though it had never happened. Sarah's eldest daughter, Ashley, threatened to call Child Protective Services. Sarah told her that if she did, she'd make sure that she had a good reason to. But other adults started noticing bruises. In one report made to Child Protective Services, Ashley was described as having a black eye, whip lacerations across her back, what appeared to be broken fingers as well. But when Ashley was questioned, she said the injuries were from an accident. The family mantra was, what happens in the house stays in the house. By now, Sarah felt immune to consequences, untouchable in the eyes of both the military and the community. Then came 2014. Sarah received a call from her eldest brother, Cody. Their grandmother, Merle, had passed away, leaving behind a house and 325 acres of prime farmland. The family drove to Missouri. Everything was friendly for the first day or so, until Sarah asked her brother about the will. Cody and his wife had been helping Merle tend the farm for years. Merle had left Cody everything and nothing to Sarah. A screaming match broke out. Later that day, a U-Haul came down the drive. Sarah spent the day loading Merle's possessions into the U-Haul. Cody let his sister do her thing, hoping it would satisfy her. He was wrong. At 2 a.m., Cody, his wife, and their 8-year-old young nephew were sleeping when Cody woke to the smell of smoke. A blaze was ripping through the drapes of the family room and across the wooden floors. Smoke was already black and billowing. He got his wife out of the house before briefly passing out, then managed to crawl out the door and to his brother's place for help, who rescued the nephew from the flames. The family were treated in hospital for smoke inhalation. The next day, Cody rang Sarah. He knew she had tried to kill them, and part of him wasn't even surprised. He just had 3 words to say to her. It didn't work. The fire department found the cause of the fire to be undetermined. A fire marshal felt differently. The fire had been lit in an area covered in poison ivy. When he questioned Sarah the following day, she had poison ivy on her face. But again, no charges were filed. The death of her grandmother marked more than just another suspicious fire in Sarah's life. It was the start of yet another extramarital affair. At her grandmother's funeral, she had run into an old childhood friend named Brian Altus. Sarah told Brian that she and Chris Donahue were getting a divorce. Brian was quickly smitten with Sarah. He would later describe her as having something irresistible, a way of talking to you that made you feel like you mattered. And then the crazy came out. He said, if I didn't answer a text, she'd send an email or a Facebook message to me. If I didn't respond quick enough to one of her questions, she would go ballistic. Whenever she was mad, it was like World War III. Soon, Brian had tired of the relationship, but Sarah hadn't. Brian filed for a restraining order. She responded by telling him that she was pregnant. Brian didn't believe her, but agreed to meet at her house, where another argument broke out. Before Sarah left, she used his bathroom, where she spent so long that it made Brian uneasy. When she eventually left, he headed to a bar to celebrate. He had been there for 20 minutes when local police called to tell him that his house was on fire. By the time it was extinguished, his home had been gutted. An investigation ruled the cause of the fire to be faulty wiring. But Brian knew Sarah's skill set. He would later tell friends that he had dodged a bullet. But the next guy in Sarah's life wouldn't be so lucky. 43-year-old David Bragg was an Air Force veteran who ran into Sarah at Fort Hood, where he was doing some contract work. Bragg had a southern charm about him. Sarah launched her own charm offensive, and soon the pair had embarked on a secret affair. With Chris Donahue stationed in South Korea, Sarah moved Bragg into their spare room and told the children he was a friend. Bragg's mother would later say that he was head over heels in love and believed Sarah was the great love of his life. Meanwhile, the long-suffering Chris Donahue was finally done. He filed for divorce, and Sarah got engaged to David Bragg. Bragg had just accepted a new job in the small town of Garfield, Minnesota, where he found an old farmhouse that needed fixing up. He took on the task of repairing it and told Sarah to wait until it was ready. She ignored him. No sooner had he started the repairs when Sarah began turning up with truckloads of household items, and before he knew it, she had moved in, along with her 3 youngest children. That is where the trouble began. Bragg's work on the house was irritating Sarah. He was moving too slow for her liking. He was making poor decisions. She criticized and berated him, regularly lost her temper, and for Bragg, alarm bells began ringing. This was the other side of Sarah, and it scared him. Bragg confessed to his brother that he wanted out. He told his parents he was deeply unhappy and began making plans to end the relationship in a way that would avoid too much upset. But he would never have the chance. On May the 9th, 2018, police were alerted to an incident at the old white farmhouse in Garfield. There, they found Sarah waiting for them, and David Bragg dead on the living room floor, a bullet in his heart. Sarah told police that Bragg had gone into a jealous rage over her ex-husband Chris and grabbed one of the 2 guns she had been carrying. As he fired, she had dived to the base of the stairs and fired back without aiming over the staircase railing. To her son, Ryan, it sounded farcical, like a bad action movie. He was the only one who doubted her story. Bragg's family knew he was an experienced military man with great marksmanship. The whole story sounded far-fetched. Bragg's brother felt it was planned.
Seeing and knowing my brother and knowing the situation around it and the conversations that he had, with my parents about leaving and getting out of the relationship, it just felt dirty. It felt wrong.
Before David Bragg died, Sarah had said to her daughter Ashley, "If anything happens and I have to defend myself, call this number and tell them to pick up the girls." When Ashley heard of the shooting, she was convinced her mom had planned to kill Bragg, believing that Chris Donahue would take her back if Bragg was no longer in the picture. An investigation found ballistic evidence that supported Sarah's claim of self-defense, and police didn't press charges. David Bragg's family were devastated. Sarah had her son Ryan clean up Bragg's blood and carried on with life as normal. Weeks later, she had moved another man in. Sarah told her foster mother Barb about the new man. At the same time, she broke the news of David Bragg's death. For Barb, this time, the crazy had become too much. She ceased contact with Sarah. Sarah's new man was 59-year-old David George, a local farmer. George would later claim that he'd only met Sarah a few times before the shooting, when he would drop off propane at the house. But in a heavily redacted affidavit from the day of the shooting, one odd detail stood out. George's name lists among those at the scene or connected to the events at the time. And there was something else unusual. On January the 31st, 5 months before the death of David Bragg, George's longtime partner, Becky Kunz, age 62, had unexpectedly died. Her death was put down to heart valve problems, but an autopsy was never conducted. Within days, she had been cremated, and George had emptied his house of her possessions before any of her family had a chance to salvage any keepsakes. Becky's brother, Dana Kunz, said that he found George vague with the details of his sister's death. Everything felt rushed, he said. Her sisters were upset that her belongings had been cleared out. Something, they said, didn't feel right. Then, on August the 31st of 2018, soon after the death of Bragg, the home George had shared with Becky mysteriously went up in flames. George told police that he and Sarah were in Texas at the time. 2018 had been a very busy year for Sarah. She had been closely connected to 2 deaths and another house fire, and she was already busy cooking up her next plan. In the summer of 2019, David George and Sarah were married. It was Sarah's 4th marriage. According to Ryan, David George was putty around Sarah. Even when she was wrong, he would agree with her, which was highly convenient for what Sarah had in mind. Soon after they were married, Sarah asked George to murder Chris Donahue's new wife, Heather. It was for the sake of her children, she said. Chris was fighting for custody of her girls. If his wife was dead, he would be too distracted to care. George would later say that he had no desire to kill anyone and believed that Sarah would tire of the idea. But the pressure from Sarah was relentless. Finally, at Sarah's insistence, he drove to Arizona with a pistol she had given him and had bought a black car specifically for the hit. He then turned up at the front door of the Donahue home under the guise of delivering flowers. Sarah had told him he couldn't come home until the job was done. This doorbell footage from the Donahue house shows George with a bouquet of roses. But instead of Chris's wife, it was Chris who answers the door. He asks if the flowers came with a card. George says he'll check, then walks to the car and drives away. George had botched the plan, and when he returned, he found himself banished from both the house and Sarah's life. The botched murder plot might have stayed secret forever had it not been for the fact that Sarah's daughters had overheard them talking and had told her father. Chris Donahue promptly contacted the FBI, who assigned a police officer to monitor the house. He also filed for full custody and a restraining order. He was granted both, but again, no charges were filed against Sarah. George told the police that the allegations were lies and fabrications and that Sarah did not present a danger. Sarah returned the favor by filing for divorce. The devoted George would later tell a journalist that he had been burned. He had loved Sarah and lied to protect her, only to be discarded. He then added that Sarah only had two loves in her life, herself and money. Predictably, Sarah was not single for long. Soon she had made the fateful connection with Joseph Hartsfield. Now 47, Sarah had retired from the military on 100% disability. She claimed she had physical injuries, post traumatic stress, severe depression, and had 3 battles with cancer in different parts of her body. Having lost custody of her children, she was free to reap havoc anywhere she chose. In January of 2022, she sold the white farmhouse and moved to Huntsville, Texas, where Joseph was living and working. 3 months later, they were married and living in Beach City. Having taken him 2 hours away from his friends and family, Sarah now tried to prevent Joseph from having any contact with them at all. Sometimes she would block their numbers on his phone without his knowledge. His friends and family raised their concerns with Joseph, who had raised the issue with Sarah. Sarah retaliated by telling Joseph that his family had normalized emotionally abusive and controlling behaviors, and that they were trying to thwart his only chance at happiness. It was her temper that finally brought Joseph to his senses. It put him in fear for his life. He began going to work hours earlier than necessary just to escape her.
He just said, Mom, I'm done. I can't do it anymore. And if I stay, she's going to drive me crazy.
In December of 2022, Sarah's messages about Joseph suddenly turned venomous. She wrote to one friend that he had destroyed the house and would regularly leave food out and mess everywhere. To another friend, she wrote, Joe has turned into a nightmare. I can't take the level of financial irresponsibility. He was just looking for a meal ticket and a way back to a lifestyle he could never attain on his own. I have to save myself and figure out how to recover. I have a plan. It's now a matter of implementing, executing, and finding a place to go. Like any normal person would, her friend assumed that she meant divorce. She told her daughter Ashley that Joe was an empty person. By Christmas, her hatred for him was all she could talk about. On the 29th of December, 2022, she posted on Facebook, a man who has mommy issues tends to approach relationship issues like a boy. Arrested development will turn a marriage into a daycare. Pay attention. Meanwhile, Joseph was making secret plans to divorce Sarah, but he was nervous. He confided in several friends that he was worried Sarah might try to kill him. His mother was also scared of what Sarah might do and prayed every night that nothing would happen to him. On January 5th, 2023, Joseph returned to Huntsville and made arrangements to stay with a relative after he had sorted things out in Beach City. He'd opened a new bank account. Again, he told friends that he was worried Sarah might do something. On January 6th, Sarah posted, The longer you entertain what's not you, the longer you postpone what is. By midnight the following day, Joseph was in a coma. A week later, he was dead. After his death, Sarah continued to post on Facebook. Her post ranged from reflections on her virtues as his wife to attacks on those who doubted her. Her last post was on February the 2nd. The next day, she was arrested for Joseph Hartsfield's murder. Unfortunately for Sarah, D.A. Leake had learned a lot about her and wanted her indicted before she had a chance to leave the county. She convened an emergency session of the county grand jury to have her indicted before the investigation into Joe's death had been completed, which was granted. Sarah was arrested and booked into the county jail on a $4.5 million bond, which was later dropped to $2 million. She pleaded not guilty.
Only on 2 tonight, for the first time, we are hearing from the woman accused of murder in Chambers County after her 5th husband died of a suspicious illness at a Baytown hospital in January. Sarah Hartsfield is behind bars on a $4.5 million bond.
Her first husband, Titus, was at home watching TV when Sarah's mugshot appeared in the evening news. He wasn't surprised at all.
Not overall, no. It's in her nature. She's killed before. When I lived with her, I feared for my life. So, no, I was just upset to hear another man had died.
Her former boss says it was more of a shock that she got caught.
It was a little bit of a surprise. A second, it was like, oh my gosh, she finally got busted. The surprise was that she got caught.
On April the 27th, 2023, a grand jury convened after new documents emerged. This time, her daughter Ashley testified for the prosecution. Sarah also testified, calling diabetes an individual responsibility. Since her arrest, the death of David Bragg has been reopened for investigation in Douglas County, as well as the death of Becky Coons, David George's wife, quote, in light of new information.
Today, the family of David Bragg, the former fiance of Sarah Hartsfield, tell us they're glad that this case is being reopened and revisited because they've had a lot of questions and concerns since this happened nearly 5 years ago. Today, the attorney in Douglas County, Minnesota, tells ABC 13 nearly 5 years since his death, they got new information and felt they needed to reopen this case. David Bragg's family says they were never able to fully move forward following his 2018 death at the hands of his fiancée, Sarah Hartsfield, whose last name was Donahue at the time. A determination letter written by Douglas County, Minnesota attorney Chad Larson 4 years ago states Sarah shot and killed Bragg after an argument became physical. An investigation determined she acted in self-defense. But now, the same attorney tells ABC 13 the sheriff's office there received new information last night, causing them to reopen the case.
As for Sarah, she is as bitter and vengeful as ever. In a statement sent to KPRC Channel 2, she wrote of Joseph's family. They were repeatedly divisive, intrusive, and didn't want to be a part of our life. They wanted to drag Joe back to a life he voluntarily left. While their pain is relevant, I lost my husband that I loved dearly. They ensured I suffered alone every step of the way, no matter how many olive branches were extended to them. Joe would be absolutely horrified at the hate campaign they enlisted against his wife. So, after so many husbands, lovers, friends, and children, who does Sarah have left? Only people who have been waiting for retribution for years. Sarah's son, Ryan Donahue, says he always believed the bad stuff would catch up with his mother. It's unreal seeing my mom in that jumpsuit now, he says. I've waited for it my whole life. As for whether there might be other victims, Sarah's son Ryan says, absolutely. There are some I have in mind that I'm kind of waiting to come to light. Sarah's response to Ryan, only that she's disappointed that they weren't supporting her after all she did for them. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like the video, click on it, and please subscribe to the channel.